Tonight, the evening mist gathers over a riverside settlement, soft as wool, carrying the smell of ash, wood smoke, and water just beginning to steam in a stone-lined pit. A small hut breathes warmth into the cold air. Inside, the rhythm is unhurried boots unlaced by the door, cloaks folded over stools, the low crackle of fire holding back the night. A carved ladle dips, tilts, and pours, tracing silver arcs through the air before vanishing into the bath with a quiet hiss. On the sill, a cone rests after its turn in the water, catching moonlight as though it were waiting for its next story. The sagas never rush this part. They speak softly of families who bathe together after long days in fields or fjords, of men and women who carried juniper and herbs on trade routes so the steam would smell faintly of distant hills. Even the language kept the memory. The Norse word lagerdagur, bath day, lingers in what we now call Saturday. The chronicles left by foreign monks often mocked the Vikings for many things, but never for being unwashed. In fact, they wrote grudgingly that no people in the north look so clean or comb their hair so often. So settle in. Let the firelight stay low, the steam rise slowly, and the stories drift at their own pace. If this quiet journey keeps you company, you can stay as long as you like. The baths will go on with or without you, as they always have. The baths will go on with or without you, as they always have. And so the steam rises, as it did in every settlement where water met fire, and the week ended with warmth instead of cold. From here, the stories begin to branch, some about the rhythms of bathing itself, others about the tools, the scents, the rituals that turned hygiene into habit, habit into culture. Follow the smoke curling toward the rafters, and it will lead us to the first tale, the weekly wash that shaped how outsiders saw the North. The quiet origin of Saturday drifts in with the steam from a riverside bath hut. The sagas do not slam doors. They pad in unfelted boots and whisper that on certain evenings a pot would simmer, and a family would share water that smelled faintly of ash and juniper. The house would creak. Someone would rinse a comb in the bucket and set it on the sill to catch moonlight, because it dries faster there. Tonight we are only watching, moving as slowly as the fog curling toward the rafters. The baths will go on with or without you, as they always have. And so the steam rises, as it did in every settlement where water met fire and the week ended with warmth instead of cold. From here, the stories begin to branch, some about the rhythms of bathing itself, others about the tools, the scents, the rituals that turned hygiene into habit, habit into culture. Follow the smoke, and it will lead us to the first tale, the weekly wash that shaped how outsiders saw the North. A surprising thing, for a people who could row all day and step straight into a brawl if provoked. Vikings were nappers when it came to grime. They bathed weekly, which in early medieval Europe was like winning a clenulous lottery drawing most people didn't enter. Imagine the social calendar. Farming, trading, a bit of raiding depending on the year, and then, just as reliably as the bread rose, the bath day. In Icelandic households, it might have been the hearth room, stones heated and water poured until a mild fog stitched itself to rafters. In Danish towns, bathhouses near the market could be rented, and if the rent was high, you simply invited more cousins and turned hygiene into a crowded conversation about sheep prices. The weekly wash was not merely medical. It was social technology, a chance to sit and soak and complain about woodcutting, a chance to drift lightly toward gossip without anyone pretending otherwise. Baths were where you heard that the shipwright's nephew had dyed his mustache. He used the strong lie, now it matched the geese. People nodded, that would do. Language kept the appointment. In Old Norse, there is a stout little word, log, meaning bath, and a bigger friend, dagr, meaning day. Together, they gave you lagerdagur, which, when carried on the sleepy shoulders of time and a few detours through other tongues, becomes Saturday. The week literally scheduled itself around a pool of warm water. You could say the calendar had a rinse cycle. Monks who wrote in tidy Latin scratched their heads at this. The idea that a day could be named after a tub felt domestic. They preferred saints and celestial motions, but naming a day after soap turned out to be the stickier option. The name stayed. The foam, too, argued for permanence as it burbled in the corners. What did cleanliness look like when the soap ran low and the mud ran high? It looked like puzzling chemistry performed with a wooden ladle. Animal fat, which by day made lamps burn and pans pop, met the gray powder of wood ash, which by night kept hearths banked and warm. The mixture produced lye, a harsh cousin of kindness, and when tamed with water, it cut through the oils of the weak, just as a fjord slices into the land. Soapstone bowls soft enough to carve with patience, and a small grin survive in the ground where wooden buckets didn't. Tea. Archaeologists lift them and find faint ghosts of fatty acids clinging to pores. It is a laboratory that smells faintly of rain. The recipe was not elegant. It was effective. You got the idea, and you got clean. If you tilt your head a little, you can see a table near the hearth where small instruments line up like well-behaved geese. Combs were a favorite. Bone and antler worked into teeth of astonishing regularity. You might expect a people who carved dragon heads for ships to finish combs with a flourish, and they often did, with little animals and knotwork, and sometimes a discreet mirror-polished metal plate tucked into the back. Daily use left the teeth shiny near their tips. Evidence of so many passes through hair that everyone in the grave mound would have understood the rhythm of it. Next to the comb sits an ear spoon, yes. We promised we would get there, no bigger than a fingernail, meant for scooping wax with a delicacy you could describe as domestic diplomacy. Tweezers appear too, tidy as a sentence, and small picks for nails. When the archaeologist brushes soil off this kit, 1,000 years later, it is like opening a travel case in a longhouse and finding a short essay on priorities. The point is not luxury. The point is grooming as a kind of peace treaty with yourself. Soap, combs, and a hot wash create an unexpected problem. If you smell of juniper and stand with your hair neat, people notice. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles grumble in their careful ink that the Danes and Norsemen bathed more than was strictly necessary. A monk here, a priest there, each reliably astonished by the shine of a raider's beard. One writer surveying the local marriage market with the suspicious eye of a man who owns exactly one tunic complained that the visiting Northmen combed every day, bathed each Saturday, and changed shirts often, thereby enticing the womenfolk with the scandalous glamour of not smelling like sheep. You can almost hear the soft slam of a quill down on parchment. History does not record whether the women nodded approvingly or simply enjoyed having fewer fleas. Either way, cleanliness had a diplomatic edge sharper than steel, an odorless kind of power that walked into halls before the speaker did. The wash ritual pushed its way into ceremony, as wash rituals like to do. Before a wedding, a family would heat stones, pour water, and invite the entire household to steam until the room hummed and gold rings felt slightly warmer on the skin. The bride's hair would be combed until it lay obediently in braids that could survive a windy hilltop ceremony. The groom would sit still for once, hands on knees, while his ears were checked with that tiny spoon. No vows had yet been spoken, and already everyone smelled like a mountain after rain. Sagas sometimes tuck these details into the background, in the way people forget to mention they left the door open for the cat. It is implied. They bathed because it would have been odd not to. And then the feast unfurled broth, bread, laughter, and the newly washed made toasts with the confidence of people who knew their neighbors could sit close without wincing. Some tools have the cheerful stubbornness of household gods. The comb keeps reappearing, buried with warriors, tucked into the jewelry box of a merchant's wife, found in the little leather pouch of a traveling trader who also kept scales, weights, a few oddly bright beads from far to the south, and a packet of powdered something that might be resin, might be myrrh, might be the sort of fragrant crumb one acquires on a long journey and hoards like an anecdote. Trade routes behave like rivers long after the river has moved. Juniper grows in the north, but scents didn't stop there. Amber holds smells the way afternoon holds heat, and it drifted along with furs and tools, until a bath in a fjord smelled a bit like a market in a sunlit city no one here had seen. When a guest arrived wearing a spice from the east, people leaned in politely and pretended not to. Public perceptions, being public, are unruly. Monks wrote their tiny complaints because ink is a safe place to pour your worries. Yet in the same manuscripts, there is grudging admiration. The foreign men, they say, arrange their hair with cream. They wear clean shirts. They carry their own combs. They are, in the dim way the chronicles will allow, well turned out. Domestic complaints about raiders coexisted with the shrugging acknowledgement that cleanliness was effective advertising. In the town, you could hear the market gossip change pitch after bath day, the way a room shifts when someone opens a window. A man who wanted to sell a cartload of dried fish showed up with his beard oiled and his cloak brushed. Suddenly his prices sounded reasonable. A woman who embroidered for a living untied her work from the frame and shook lint out into the wind after washing her hands. The white thread gleamed like new snow. Even a hardened trader enjoys a clean bargaining partner, because the mind has only so many tasks it can do at once. Remove the task of ignoring a smell, and suddenly people become agreeable. Every custom grows a mythology like moss. When you do something weekly for generations, it acquires stories. The bath day wandered into the realm of gods. Thor had storms to manage, Freyr had fields to coax, and somewhere under the loft rafters, the spirits of hearth and house were supposed to appreciate a swept floor, a rinse bowl, a comb set teeth down so the luck didn't fall through. We do not have a clearly labeled deity of cleanliness, complete with a little hammer-shaped loofah. Still, sagas hint that ritual purity mattered before sacrifices and oaths. To wash was to be ready to be seen by gods as much as neighbors. There was a belief, soft and sensible, that dirt might confuse the spirits the way stray noise confuses a meeting. So you corrected for static, you rinsed. You presented yourself as the best version of a being who had dealt with sheep all week. Once more, let us step into the bathhouse. It is a low timber building near a stream, set at the polite distance a steamy building prefers. Inside, benches wait along the walls. There's a high shelf for combs. Someone has brought birch twigs, not to whip the air into morality, but because they smell green. Stones glow through darkness like sleepy stars. A ladle hovers over the bucket, and when it tips, the room purrs. There are rules everyone knows, but no one says. Do not hog the heat. Rinse the comb. Hang your shirt on a peg you will remember. Speak as if the steam might carry your words into next week. In the corner, an old man closes his eyes and lifts his face, exactly as a cat does when a patch of sun moves across the floor. This is not a heroic scene, except it is, because surviving winter is heroic and cleanliness helps. What did they use on their hair? The answer is both dull and satisfying. Oil from what the land gave, animal fat when honor allowed it, and sometimes lye water to lighten or stiffen strands. The strong solution could turn a blonde beard, a blonder boldness. The wrong concentration could turn it into a lesson in humility. If someone's mustache looked stiffer than usual, you might congratulate him on bravery and chemistry. The line between perfume and medicine blurred. Juniper smoke doubled as a disinfectant before anyone used that word at a feast. Birch tar gave a faint resinous note that said forests more convincingly than any poem. When snowland drifts outside, a family might burn dried herbs in a small bowl, pretend it was midsummer, and the imagination, easy to convince at night, agreed. Ear spoons nudge us again. They are small and somehow determined. One imagines a quick scrape, a tidy wipe on a cloth, and life once again sounds like muffled laughter. The tool carried absolute neutrality. It would sit on a desk today and be mistaken for something that came with a pin set. Its existence argues for a daily routine so established that tiny acts did not need comment. In the same way, the tweezers tucked away in the pouch ask for a moment of quiet removal. There is a soft humor in the idea of a man who could take a fortress, also taking a splinter out of his own thumb with great care. In that pause, you see the household again. Victory is splashy, cleanliness hums. There is a market day after bath day, and the air tastes like cold metal and bread. People touch cloth on display and compare thickness with thumb and forefinger. A trader from far south lets them sniff a small vial amber-colored, probably pine resin cut with something he will not name, and watches their eyes as they weigh desire against price. He has met this calculation before. To sweeten the bargain, he offers a ball of scented wool, the sort housewives tuck into chests. When opened months later on a dark morning, it will pretend to be summer. That promise is worth a little silver. He packages the wool slowly, because everything here is slow, and because the deliberate pace of trade makes people feel wise. English clerics who had not scheduled such joy into their weeks continued to write about the problem of excessively clean visitors. They were perturbed by shirts. Fresh linen struck them as a statement. When a Dane put on a new tunic on bath day, the cloth lay on his shoulders with the crisp logic of a well-made argument. And so the chronicles mention the washing and the changing of clothes, as if repeated cleanliness could seduce a town right off its moral foundation. There is the comic image of a monk lecturing about frivolity while privately wondering what it would feel like to put on a tunic that didn't remember every single Tuesday since Epiphany. If we want to be very boring, and we do, it is the point we can count how cleanliness threads through trade, marriage, war, and laundry. It removes obstacles. It makes conversation in close rooms possible. It smooths courtship like sanded oak. It is not dramatic. It is practiced. When a ship set out from a Norwegian harbor, the crew would have liked to begin in a civilized condition, not because the sea noticed, but because a week in close quarters rewards courtesy. You can be brave and tidy at once. Many have tried the alternate combination and found it inferior. Rituals require a place, and the bathhouse gave architecture to intention. The building also gave language a stage. From Lagerdyker onward, the week ticked like a water clock. It still does, in a way. We say Saturday without noticing the little hiss of steam inside the word. If words carry weather, this one carries mist. Even now, when you stand in a modern bathroom with its tile and its echo, you are accidentally participating in a very old community event. You wash, you comb, you adjust the light. You check an ear with an instrument designed by a committee of nurses who would perhaps have found an ear spoon charming. Then you go outside and greet your neighbors, which is exactly what they did, give or take a sheep. I like to think of the after-bath braid, the way it holds, like a promise. The hands that made it have done it so often that each twist is memory. Mothers braided daughters, friends braided each other before a feast. A man with very long hair borrowed his cousin's patience for a few minutes because wind would be strong on the headland. If you ask the comb where it has been, it will only answer by being warm from so much use. Domestic time passes differently. There is no dramatic arc. There is the glow of a bucket near the hearth. There is a shirt hung up to dry and moved to a peg near the door, not because it matters, but because it is habit. And habit is civilization with the volume turned down. And so we drift to the edge of the town, where the bathhouse exhaled once, twice, and became another low roof among low roofs. The moon sits above the stream like a quiet coin wedged in a crack. Someone inside has forgotten a towel. There is always one. Another person returns with a laugh, swears softly, and the door opens, letting out a stripe of heat that smells like clean wood. Later, on a winter night, a linen chest will open and send a small breath of juniper into the room. And in that second, a child will learn that seasons are containers with lids. People will always chase that scent, even if they call it by new names. And when Saturday arrives again, it will do so with an old logic, one that tells you to make water warm, to set the combs in a row like small boats, to steam your week into slowness, and to drift cleaner and calmer into the kind of sleep a river teaches, which does not end so much as continue. You might not expect a room full of misaddressed envelopes to have a smell, but the 19th century's dead letter offices were essentially museums of faint perfume and accidental glue. Imagine a quiet building near a rail yard where the clocks tick a little louder than strictly necessary, and where bundles of letters arrive tied with twine that has learned patience. The bags are emptied and the day's driftwood spreads across long tables. Envelopes without towns, parcels with names but no streets, folded notes so enthusiastic with sealing wax that the wax itself forms a clue. If you were still awake by the time I reached the shelf where clerks stored mysterious buttons found loose in packages, yes, there was a shelf for unclaimed buttons. You can subscribe or simply let the idea float by like tissue paper, utterly untroubled and almost weightless. The dead letter office is not where letters go to die, as much as where they go to be gently persuaded back to life. A clerk begins with the envelope because the envelope is the letter's clothing, and clothing says more than people think. Paper varies in tooth and tint and confidence. A faint blue-laid paper announces a stationer who sells confidence by the choir. A rough, straw-flecked sheet announces thrift with the pride of someone who can repair boots. The corner bears a stamp. Stamps in those decades are small lectures on empire. If the stamp sits at an odd angle, tilted, the clerk lifts an eyebrow as if the writer had cleared his throat mid-sentence. The cancellation mark is not merely a smear. It is a calendar entry in circles. A good clerk reads it the way a baker reads crusts. Over time, the clerks learn that certain towns smudge in characteristic ways. This letter passed through a coastal place where ink and fog conspire, perhaps on a Thursday. The envelope does not give up its secrets quickly, but it does give them up. Opening is a moral act and therefore done with ceremony. There is a thin blade, dull at the tip, honed by use into a companion rather than a tool. A gentle pressure along the seam, a breath, and the letter sighs open. That sigh might be imagined, but everyone at the table hears it. Some letters are mended first rewetted with a brush to unstick a crease, or nudged flat under a sheet of clean glass. The glass is there because patience likes company. The clerk, who has learned to read handwritings the way a gardener reads leaves, examines the address within. People very often remember to write their own name in full only after sealing the envelope. Inside they bloom with information. Please direct reply to my lodgings near the west gate, third house after the Cooper, the one with an events, which is funny in a way that is almost tender, because it presumes the world remembers the Cooper as clearly as the writer does. The clerk notes it, pencils a small direction in the margin, and reseals with wafer paste that smells faintly like success and starch. Not every letter yields. Some fold secrets inside like a badly tied knot. The office gives the knot time to loosen. Packages pose their own puzzles. Here's a box that rattles. It could be marbles, or it could be buckshot. The manifest claims samples, which is a word with the elasticity of a very patient cat. Another parcel claims one bonnet. Bonnet-shaped things arrive depressingly unbonnet-like. You can tell an entire relationship from the way an ant wraps tissue around a bonnet. She wraps air, care, and the possibility that her niece will wear the gift to church and look like a tidy field of wheat. The dead letter office, custodians of air and care, now decides whether to conserve or dismantle. Dismantling is done with the politeness one uses when sorting a friend's buttons. The paper is snipped along the seam least likely to complain. If the contents make sense, a small note falls out with a name. An invoice begs to be helpful. There's a brief moment of professional triumph measured in millimeters. The clerks develop talents no one hires for. They become expert at deciphering spilled ink, as if it were the foam on beer telling fortunes. They learn to weigh a letter in the hand and guess whether it hides a coin taped to the interior, because people don't trust envelopes to keep a promise. They become amateur perfumers simply by observation. A letter from a particular mill town always smells of oil and warm metal. A letter from a certain neighborhood in Paris arrives with a whiff of violet water that has tried very hard to remain plausible during the long trip. A letter from a farm carries a dull, honest aroma of sun-warmed dust. The clerks do not judge. They simply know. When a novice asks, a veteran might say, "This one is from someone who was interrupted by a kettle and returned to the page with slightly smaller handwriting." It is not exaggeration. It is literacy expanded to include the texture of pauses. Among the office's quiet charms are the tools. Aside from the letter openers and the wafers of paste, there are tiny glass bottles of ungumming fluid, a phrase that would make modern packaging blush, and trays of spare seals, a generic anchor for a sailor's unclaimed letter, a modest wreath for a dressmaker's note, neutral shapes that say, "We touch this with care." There are stacks of forms with simple requests for better directions next time, forms that walk a polite line between help and instruction. There are magnifiers for old eyes and young eyes that pretend not to need them. A drawer contains a small forest of pencils sharpened to quills, not fine points. Fine points puncture the day. You can picture the rhythm of it: pencil clicks, envelope breaths, the soft hoofbeat of stamps being pressed into ink. There is a comedy of addresses. To Miss Mary, who lives near the little bridge, from the man she knows. The office wants very much to help Miss Mary and the man she knows. They consult maps, which is always soothing because maps are tidy. Unfortunately, towns breed little bridges the way hedges breed sparrows. Another letter tries for poetry to my dearest, where the peonies bloom, and finds itself briefly admired and then carefully puzzled over, as peonies are a poor navigational aid in November. Then there are the letters written by people who believe the post is clairvoyant. To the German violinist who played at the fair with gratitude from the older couple, the clerk sets it aside in a small stack labeled, in a completely unofficial way, kindness. Kindnesses are given extra time and sometimes a miracle. A colleague's cousin may remember the fair and the violinist, and that is a root as sound as any. In time, the public's feelings toward the dead letter office gather like lint small, fibrous, and strangely revealing. Newspapers print stories about recovered treasures, a ring matched to a name, a photograph returned to a widow who wanted nothing else in the world, a stack of foreign notes neatly remitted to a stunned school teacher. These are true, and the office keeps a ledger of them. The ledger is written by someone chosen for legible gratitude. The entries begin with the plainness of accounting and end with a little glow. That the dead letter office is also a magnet for suspicion. If a parcel is lost, people imagine rooms of bored clerks reading love letters aloud to amuse themselves, which is about as likely as bakers making bread for the pleasure of turning flour into fog. They work. They do not hoard romance. Micro Hook, one director, irritated by rumor, published an inventory and included the statistic that they had returned, resealed, and rerouted 1,007 letters bearing nothing inside but pressed leaves. If anything, this only added to the office's mythic aura. People pictured warehouses of autumn. The auctions arrive as a practical end to an impractical problem. Some letters resist every address-guessing charm. Some parcels, opened with a clean conscience, reveal items that cannot be stored indefinitely. In steps the auctioneer, brisk as a clock with legs. Tables are spread with lots so varied they look like a polite dream. A pair of boots clearly meant for someone with ambitions one size too big. A box of silk ribbons faded in a gradient, the way sunsets know to be beautiful while losing strength. A much-traveled book of sermons with someone's neat annotations reading, good point, and a careful hand every 4 pages. People bid modestly. There is, as always, someone who collects clocks and ends up with a clock he doesn't love but respects. There is another who bids on a box labeled daguerreotypes, without knowing precisely what that entails, and then spends the evening peering at silvered faces that will never return his gaze. The office records the proceeds, trims hanging threads of legal obligation, and goes back to opening envelopes. Invisible ink enjoys a permanent position at the edge of mystery. Postal clerks do not, as a rule, hold letters up to candle flames. That is Drama's job, and Drama works in another building. But they are prepared for oddities. Certain decades, especially when war shadows the headlines, bring waves of cleverly blank sheets that bloom with lemon juice revelations over heat. The office's stance is pragmatic. If a letter can be forwarded once the secret address appears, it is forwarded. If not, the clerks let the message fade again without comment, like a tide that forgets to return and finds the omission suits the shoreline. They have more pressing puzzles. A letter that seems to be written by 2 hands, one large, one small, half in Danish, half in determined English, every capital letter shaped like a fence post. This kind they solve because determination is a scent even faint noses catch. Beyond the letters, there are the parcels that perform small feats of sociology. A hat band intended for the gentleman with the lopsided hat suggests a town in which hats outnumbered gentlemen and lopsidedness was a signature. A parcel of spices and a stitched cotton bag, a dress bled by rain, arrives smelling like optimism that has learned geography. Clerks sometimes catch a grain of spice and slip it into a tiny vial labeled for the cabinet, because the office maintains, without admitting it aloud, a cabinet of smells. It is not public. It is shared by no one outside the room. When a long day ends, a clerk might lift a cork and breathe saffron, then put it back, as if putting summer away on a high shelf for later. Tools for resealing are their own little art. Wax sits in sticks, some red as a legal argument, some black for mourning, some brown for the middle of life where most letters live. The office favors a neutral seal, a smooth circle with a crisp edge. When pressed, it asserts safe passage more than secret society. There are also wafer seals, gummed discs of starch that pretend to be. Wax if you squint, which the office uses for speed. There is a paste made from flour that resembles childhood crafts and works better than anyone admits. The brush is narrow, the movement practiced. The resealed letter looks whole, as if it had always intended to be opened and closed again, as if every message expected a brief nap. There is always one drawer of the office furniture reserved for handwriting samples. They call it the gallery. Inside are envelopes kept because they teach. The clerk in charge will pull one and set it on the trainee's desk. Here, he says, is a man who writes like a nest. See how the words thicken in spring when he is busy and thin out after harvest. If you learn the seasons of a hand, you learn its path. Another sample shows a professional copyist's calligraphy, beautiful and therefore deceptive. Beautiful writing often hides poor information. The gallery is not sentimental. It is practical memory. A quiet comedy runs through everything. The mismatch between intent and delivery. A note that says the key is under the mat, travels 500 miles, heavy with trust, to a house that has no mat and several keys whose purposes are forgotten. A letter that states, as we said on the corner by the bakery, searches for a town with 3 bakeries and corners like rabbits. A parcel that reads, for the boy who fixed our gate, finds an office of clerks who would fix any date in front of them, but are not boys. And there is a pause, the sort you fill with a kind smile, even if no one sees. The letter is resealed. The world is large. Gates somehow get fixed anyway. Public tours occasionally pass through very quietly, watching the desks from a roped aisle the way one watches tame animals chew thoughtfully. Children look hard at the piles of envelopes and wonder if any contain miracles. The guide explains the statistics. So many thousands delivered, so many found, so many forwarded with triumph, and the numbers are soothing in their climb. Adults peer at the auction notices and imagine bidding themselves into tiny histories. The clerks keep working because the work is itself a kind of calm. There are few emergencies. There is almost always time to finish a page, a practice the modern world keep meaning to rediscover. Sometimes, along the tables, a letter arrives whose handwriting belongs to a child just learning to make loops. The address says something like, "To Grandmama on the hill where cherries grow," and the stamp is slightly tilted, and the envelope contains not money, but a drawing of a hat, which the child believes is currency of a sort. The clerks handle such letters as if the ink were still wet. Often there is enough information, surname, an old direction to try. A surprising number arrive. The office takes disproportionate joy in this. They do not record it as a success. They simply keep it in the part of memory that does not need inventory. There are seasons in lost mail. Holiday parcels are tied with strings that secretly want to be bows. Summer letters are posted from places where people pretend not to be sunburned. Autumn brings invitations, which mean well. Spring sends announcements of resolutions. Some of those resolutions, perhaps, were delivered, and some sat a long time on the clerk's table and learned humility. The machinery adjusts. Extra tables appear in December the way leaves appear in May. A barrel is placed near the door for the inevitable unclaimed umbrellas. The umbrellas stand like shy soldiers. At auction, someone buys 5 at once and gains the power to be generous to strangers for a year. When evening comes and the bags are emptied and the paste has formed a thin crust on the rim of its jar, the office apprentices reseat the chairs under the desks as if the chairs too had addresses. There is a small broom for crumbs of paper. The ledgers are closed with a sound like a decision. On the wall, a clock observes that time has continued, even when letters haven't. Someone blows out a lamp, reluctantly because lamps prefer continuity. A last envelope is placed on a shelf with a note. Tomorrow, perhaps. Tomorrow obliges more often than not. The dead letter office is, in the calmest sense, a study in human intention. People are always trying to reach each other through fog. They leave off a street number and trust to waned. They rely on a description of a gate. They write, "The woman with the thoughtful hat," and hope the world agrees on which hat counts as thoughtful. In between, there is a room where envelopes are read as if they were faces, where paper is mended as if it were skin, and where addresses are coaxed rather than commanded. The room does not judge. It forwards. It does not collect. It returns. It lives in the small space between almost and at last. We arrive where all quiet buildings arrive, at the door, closing. Someone checks that the cabinet of smells is shut, not because saffron escapes, but because memory does. Someone smooths the last strip of wax across a letter bound for a town with 2 bakeries and a new lamppost, which will be enough. Someone writes a note to a distant postmaster on a scrap, so neat it could be an invitation to a tea. Then the lights go down, and the day's puzzles sleep with the envelopes. Outside, a train considers whether to whistle. Far away, a woman with a lopsided hat finds a hatband she did not expect and ties it with the kind of satisfaction that registers only to the wearer. In the morning, more bags will open, more knots will loosen, and the work will continue its mild choreography. Detail, expansion, a small smile, and a fading back into the hum of rails and paper, until even the clerks walk like letters, addressed well enough to reach home without hurry. You might not expect the word for Saturday to hide a bar of soap, but in Old Norse it more or less does, and that is a very Viking way to label a weekend. Laugardegger washing day rolled in with the same quiet regularity as the tide. and with it came steam, stones, and the respectable business of becoming presentable. The weak in the north could be a squeaky thing linen and wool and layers boots that squealed when thawed hair under. Caps that learned to point in strange directions, but the custom of the weekly bath put a soft comment in the noise. People saved chores for it. Shirts were aired like small flags. Water was warmed in kettles that remembered fish, and someone always forgot the ladle. Village pits lined with stones held heated water that calmed itself the way soup calms under a lid. At the edge, a boy poked a toe in and announced a temperature with the solemnity of a priest. Older men shook their heads as if heat were a form of bragging. An observer from farther south might have found it excessive clean in a way that sounded suspiciously like habit. If you're still awake by the time we talk about ear spoons, which are exactly what they sound like, but also somehow a philosophy, you can subscribe, or simply let the thought dissolve like steam against a roof beam. The weekly wash wasn't luxury, it was a clock. Every 7 days, the landscape acquired a different smell-less sheet. More warm water and ashen conversations drifted into the lazy territory of combs, of beards that had behaved or needed reminding. Some travelers wrote about the baths as if they were public theaters, the rocks placed just so to hold kettles, the benches that looked temporary and turned out to be permanent, the low murmur of practical gossip. In the half-light of northern evening, steam made everyone look a little saintly and a little indecisive. People arrived with bundles and left as if unburdened by more than wool. The ritual politely ignored the cold. Snow on the ground worked like a garnish you didn't actually eat. Monks visiting from across the sea recorded the scene with a tone somewhere between disapproval and envy, noting that the men from the north washed weekly and combed daily, which seemed unfair to anyone hoping barbarians would cooperate with the stereotype. A farmer might walk past the churchyard on washing day, smelling faintly of juniper. He would nod to the priest in precisely the clean way a man nods when he knows the shine of his beard is visible at 20 paces. Linguists like to point at Lagerdecker and smile a little because the word survived long enough to be a calendar entry, and calendars don't generally keep house with bathtubs. The label clung because the habit did. A bath that returns and returns becomes a weekday. The tools of cleanliness would fit in a pouch if you were patient, and Vikings were good at pouches. Soap, for instance, was a kitchen invention with an outdoor career. Animal fat boiled with ash until the mixture learned to be caustic and useful. Soapstone small cauldrons from steatite, friendly to fire held the simmer while a house smelled like an apology to dinner. The resulting paste was not delicate. It did its job and considered negotiations a waste of time. Still, people knew how to sweeten it with herbs when the season allowed. A sigh of sweet gale here, a draught of bog myrtle there. Anyone who has tried to carve a spoon knows the temptation to keep carving, and Combs had the same problem. Antler teeth multiplied, precise and symmetrical, because a person who could shape a keel could shape personal order. Combs were shown off the way a belt is shown off, incidentally, with hope of being incidentally noticed. Ear spoons existed in a quantity that suggests not obsession but consistency, a pocket ritual with a small metal flourish. You reach for the spoon because reaching without it feels like forgetting to lock a door. Tweezers, too, appear with stubborn regularity in graves, which might not mean vanity so much as the intimate satisfaction of a straight line returned to where it belongs. Beard culture, as we would call it if we were being a little silly and a little accurate, functioned like a social shore. You could tell where you were by the shape of the waves. Long beards, forked beards, beards tamed by bronze combs, mustaches that pointed slightly outward as if ready to leave. There is a field guide somewhere in the minds of the people who maintain them. Soap had a personality. Lye-heavy paste could bite a little, so a cautious person might rub animal fat on skin after washing, then run a comb through hair until it behaved like a reasonable conversation. The soap lived in a lidded vessel, not because it needed secrecy, but because the vessel taught it manners. In spring, the soap-making kettle remembers tallow and speaks in low bubbles that carry through open doors. In winter, the kettle remembers warmth and behaves like a hearth extension. Children learned about chemistry without knowing the word. Water that stung if you stared at it. Ash that made the stinging meaningful, fat that negotiated peace. A comb carved from antler picked up heat from the hand and grew so familiar it might as well have been named. The act of combing becomes a pause that repeats through a day absolutely willing to fray. One micro-hook among many, in a century not particularly associated with pocket hygiene archaeologists. Keep finding travel-sized grooming kits clipped like charms to belts, a comb tweezers and the ear spoon so neatly made you imagine they came, with polite instructions printed in runes. Use after trait before boasting. Public perception toddled along behind all of this, trying to catch up without looking out of breath. Anglo-Saxon chroniclers, otherwise skilled in the art of sharp adjectives, found themselves at a loss and settled on complaint. The northern men, they said, washed often, changed shirts more than strictly necessary, and combed their hair with an energy that put local suitors at a disadvantage. It is hard to compete with a beard that respects geometry. In marketplaces where reputation sold as quickly as grain, a well-groomed stranger could resemble a roomer with shoes. The criticism that Vikings stole wives and daughters has the clatter of propaganda, but tucked inside is a grudging note about appearance. Cleanliness is unfair, it whispers to those who don't practice it. This is not quite a history of seduction, only a history of noticing. A man with a fresh shirt smells like he can afford one tomorrow. In sagas, baths appear at the edges of important days, like the soft pencil line under a word you intend to revisit. Before feasts and weddings, people visit the bathhouses, which were sometimes houses and sometimes hot springs with ambition. The baths operate like a town square that has chosen to be humid. News moves faster in steam, and jokes move most quickly of all. The ritual is communal, not secret. It is infrastructure disguised as comfort. Water finds the right temperature. Somebody calibrates it with a patience born of repetition. Stones, spotted with minerals, keep a kind of polite heat. Wooden tubs with iron hoops scour clean more easily than some reputations. People wash before stepping into good clothes, and a hall full of clean people smells different than a hall full of merely present people. The difference announces itself the way a harp announces itself when someone responsible is holding it. Archaeological evidence suggests Iceland maintained bathhouses with the calm seriousness of a people who know the value of predictable warmth. Saga writers understood that an argument cooled in a bathhouse could be reheated or not, and that the body listens to steam even when the mind pretends impatience. All this cleanliness had a way of leaking into economics. Grooming tools served not just for grooming, but as portable respect. A trader who cleans his nails before unwrapping silver is promising, with very small gestures, that he won't short you on weights. Markets are choreography, the display of goods, the mild sparkle of a buckle, the sunlight finding the polish on a comb's spine. When a man adjusted his beard and the reflective curve of a polished shield, he was doing two things at once, making himself tidy and proving, without a word, that he kept metal bright. Micro Huck, one law code fined men for cutting another's hair without consent, which tells you two things: people valued their hair, and lawmakers had already seen jokes get out of hand. In marriage negotiations, the ritual bath and the clean shirt stood beside the gifts and the words, not louder, but present. Families wanted to know a household owned buckets that never went empty and combs that didn't wander off. Domestic order says something about future prosperity. A tidy storeroom and a tidy beard rhyme. Beyond baths lay perfumes, which is to say, the polite ghost of plants. Northern air is good at preventing rot, but also good at erasing scent, so people tucked fragrance close. Sachets sewn from scraps, filled with juniper berries that had opinions, angelica root that behaved like a kindly elder, and birch bark shaved into curls with a small knife that made small thoughts. The sachets hid in chests and the folds of clothing, offering gentle hints of places where midsummer is permanent. Trade made the scents more ambitious. Through river routes and markets with names that sound like boats themselves, exotic resins traveled slowly north, a whisper of frankincense, a polite suggestion of imported oil held in a little glass jar that looked like a frozen tear. A household might own one such jar the way a household owns a song carefully, sparingly with the belief that it improves the day, even when not in use. Travelers came home smelling like places the weather had only read about. A fur cloak holds scent timorously at first, and then with surprising loyalty. The chest where clothes slept between voyages became a minor archive far away. Perfume had practical work. A sachet in a linen chest said, "We care for the future noses of guests." A sprinkle of juniper smoke in a bath lifted the steam into a register that suggested hospitality took notes. Even animals learned to read it. A dog slept near the chest with the juniper because the chest spoke gently of walks. People moving through a crowded hall brought their scent signatures with them like quiet flags. Fish oil and wool, tallow and juniper, wood smoke, and the occasional olive note that meant someone had traded cleverly. The combinations wrote a social ledger for those who cared to read it. This man's cloak says he lives with sheep, but not sheep's opinions. That woman's shawl remembers the bark of a southern tree. None of it was loud. Loud scents do not survive freeze-thaw cycles. Soft ones learn to pace themselves. Mythology cannot leave cleanliness alone because gods, like neighbors, notice what you do with water. Before sacrifices and oaths, people washed hands and faces, a gesture that made the gods more comfortable and the participants more alert. A basin near a temple door is an architectural way of saying, begin as if you were a page. The act was symbolic but also obvious. Grease and smoke have their place. They did not belong at the threshold where words and promises tried to be clear. In stories, purity and luck shake hands politely. A hunting party washes before asking the forest for cooperation. Sailors rinse salt from hair before asking wind to choose their sailcloth wisely. Somewhere a storyteller invents a god whose displeasure manifests as stains that refuse to lift. And mothers find this story particularly useful. Ritual cleanliness did not mean constant cleanliness, people. Lived in weather and work, but it put a bright line under moments when order mattered. A last little paradox keeps the topic humane. For a people famous for storms and swords, the details that surface from graves are irrefutably domestic. A comb tucked up the shoulder, a pair of tweezers resting like parentheses near a belt buckle, a small ear spoon with a loop for the finger as if absent-mindedness were an old friend. These are objects that someone thought worth the trouble of bringing along forever. They say, however far north we sail, a straight part in the hair is a good way to begin. They also say, without saying, that self-respect is inexpensive when practiced steadily. In a world that can rust or rot or freeze things in inconvenient attitudes, a weekly bath and a careful combing were acts of rebellion against blur. So if you picture Vikings, you may include boats, yes, and iron and weather that chastens hats, but also picture rooms warmed with stones, mornings that start with a splash, pockets where tools shine from oil, and use, and small cloth sachets that leak juniper into a chest like a promise not to forget summer. Think of language that keeps washing day on the weekly roll call the way some people keep the name of a favorite dish close to the kitchen. Imagine the sociophysics of a man who arrives well-groomed at a market and finds prices slightly more flexible just because he looks like he respects arithmetic. Or the quiet domesticity of a woman who threads a scented sprig into the seam of a shirt because the boy who will wear it is traveling east and she wants him to carry the idea of home at the level of his nose. All these are small motions. Small motions performed weekly become culture. And as the steam thins and the stones give back their warmth to the ground, the bathhouse empties with a softness usually reserved for libraries closing at dusk. Combs slide into their places. The soap lid clicks like a satisfied syllable. Someone hangs a shirt where the wind will finish what water began. The week, smaller by one ritual and larger by the precise amount of calm that ritual provides, takes its familiar shape again. There will be boats and markets and the long, reasonable business of living, and next Lagerdigger the same dance will return. Detail, expansion, a half smile at a shiny beard, and a gentle drift back into whatever work the weather allows, until even talk of ear spoons feels like the perfect cue to let the mind wander towards sleep. You might not expect a weekday to smell faintly of juniper and hot stones, but in the north there was one that did, and the name gave the secret away. The word rolled off tongues like warm water, Lagerdigger, the day of washing, which is the kind of branding a calendar rarely attempts. By the time the sun lifted itself over low roofs and smoke holes, the paths were already worn toward the pits and tubs, and the air practiced being steam. Saturday did not rush. It arrived with wooden buckets that remembered last week with kindling sorted by people who knew the personalities of twigs, with that unfussy kind of social life that happens when everyone has set down their swords and picked up ladles. If you were somehow still awake when we reached the part about ear, spoons, the tiny metal implements that made being a person feel like maintaining a very small boat, feel free to subscribe. Or let the thought drift away like fog leaving a field. I won't check. Bathing weekly sounds almost extravagant for the early medieval centuries, yet the sources agree with a shrug that feels very practical. Travelers from monasteries wrote as if filing weather reports. The northern men wash, they comb, they change shirts more often than the story permits. It is the clerical version of a raised eyebrow. The wash was public enough to be a social appointment, private enough to remain polite. Stones range a shallow pool. Wooden tubs leaned against posts like tired oxen. A kettle the size of an argument perched over a fire, and someone whose job was to look thoughtful tested the water with a stick. Children were sent to fetch more water and returned having invented quests. Old men shared advice on the correct temperature with the authority of prophets. Old women answered by doing it properly. You can almost hear the soft percussion of water on wood, the hiss when hot stones slipped in, the dignified slosh of a bucket carried by a person who refuses to spill as a point of principle. Saturday, very gently, made everyone symmetrical again. Language preserved the habit. The day's name survived migrations, church reforms, and the occasional argument about whether warm water is character building. Words that last usually attach themselves to food or God. This one fastened itself to cleanliness and refused to budge. It is hard to imagine a culture so tidy that the calendar keeps a reminder, yet here it sits, a post-it note in Old Norse. The custom orbited other small customs. Shirts aired near doors on washing day, and a breeze became part of the ritual, as if the wind were being asked to sign the attendance roll. Soap hung around the edges of the operation like a practical uncle, and combs, which could be carved in a winter evening, turned up as frequently as complaints about the price of salt. Nothing about it felt dramatic. The statiest things rarely do. The tools of cleanliness were part kitchen, part jewelry box, and part confession that people enjoy small order. Soap was a pot decision, animal fat melting into lye until the mixture announced, by smell and sting, that it had turned from food into discipline. Ash from the hearth did the teaching. Rainwater supplied patience. If you have ever watched a stew change character and known, somewhere between one bubble and the next, that it had agreed to be stew, you know the feeling. Soap never forgot its origin. It claimed like something slightly offended by dirt's presumption, but people knew how to soften it. A handful of ground herbs when the season allowed, a ribbon of oil if trade had been kind. A few drops of something imported that smelled of hot markets and sun-tired roofs. Stored in a lidded vessel, stone or clay, thumb smooth, the soap weighted with the serene confidence of a tool that gets used every week. Combs made from antler, whalebone, or occasionally wood were little diagrams of patience. The teeth were precise enough to suggest that the maker had opinions about measurement, and the frame was often decorated with gentle geometry that refused to shout. A good comb wormed quickly in the hand and learned which direction hair wanted to go, like a teacher who knows the class and lets the lesson slide that way. Tweezers turned up with unnerving regularity in graves, which might be evidence of vanity or, more charitably, of a deeply rooted belief that straight lines feel better than crooked ones. Ear spoons, tiny, curved, easy to loop onto a ring or cord, completed the traveling kit. Archaeologists keep finding these little assemblies clipped to belts, and the image is hard to resist. A trader reaches for weights, a buyer reaches for silver, both notice the bright wink of a comb's spine and draw the same conclusion about the person in front of them. Cleanliness becomes a handshake you can wear. Soap had seasons. In summer it behaved like an impatient friend and went to work immediately. In winter it needed a moment to remember it was soap. Someone kept a kettle just for lye work because the taste would haunt porridge in unhelpful ways. The stirring paddle acquired a personality. Not that paddle, a grandmother says into the room, and no one asks why. The smell of ash water became a kind of time stomp. That must have been late spring, because the soap smelled of birch leaves. What we call personal care now would have sounded like a committee. Back then it was simply maintenance, the domestic version of sharpening a seeks or patching a sail. If your hair met a comb in the morning, your day went in straight lines for at least a while. A beard that could be parted down the middle suggested that other things in your life might also part when asked politely. Public perception wobbled around all this like a slightly tipsy bystander trying to look unimpressed. Anglo-Saxon writers frequently filed the complaint that northern men changed shirts more than reasonable, combed their hair with alarming vigor, and, most unfairly, improved their prospects with local women by smelling less like last week. It is an ancient truth of the marriage market. Hygiene functions as an interest rate. The better you appear, the more favorable the terms, even when no one mentions numbers. In trading towns along coasts and rivers, a clean tunic, a beard that did as it was told, and a comb whose teeth all matched suggested a home where other things lined up. Grain sacks, accounts, promises. On feast days, the bathhouse worked as a social equalizer. Everyone came out the same exact shade of rosy. If you're still listening, a small microfact to reward you. Some law codes specified fines for cutting another man's hair without permission. Somewhere, a prank went too far and became legislation. Ritual baths appeared before events that asked for order weddings, oaths, the beginning of voyages. Icelandic sagas speak of bathhouses kept like livestock, fed with wood, fenced with turf, tended as part of the property. Families gathered the evening before a wedding and washed not to chase drama away, but to keep it polite. The steam room became a temporary court of kindness. Arguments reframed themselves into jokes, then into silence. Clothes waited on pegs to be put on in a sequence everyone understood. There is likely nothing mystical about water's ability to calm people who are about to eat together, yet cultures from many latitudes keep independently discovering this trick. The door from bath to hall acts like a soft threshold, and crossing it sensible and clean feels almost like a vow. Hair had its own diplomacy. We move through the sources and catch glimpses. A bride's hair oiled and braided while women swap stories they will deny tomorrow. A groom's beard trimmed into something that looks accidental but definitely is not. Mirrors were poor, so people became each other's mirrors, stepping back to nod, leaning in to correct a line, drafting their approval into smiles that could be worn all evening. A comb might pass around a room like a cup. Someone sharpened a razor on a strip of leather. Someone else explained, for the 100th time, the correct angle for a clean cheek. The advice wasn't new, but on the threshold of a feast it felt ceremonial. You might think of a modern barbershop on a Saturday when talk loops back on itself, because everyone already knows the plot and enjoys the repetition more than any twist. Beyond baths lay perfume nothing dramatic, nothing that reached a door before the person did, just the soft persistence of plants domesticated into scent. Juniper berries found their way into cloth sachets, angelica root into linen drawers, and dwarf birch into the corners of chests built as seriously as boats. You have to imagine the patience of it. A chest becomes a season when you open it. The memory of last midsummer drifts out, thin but confident. Trade routes stitched the north to the south with the quiet authority of rivers, and the ribbon carried resins and oils in tiny amounts. A drop of imported frankincense in a bowl of hot water turned steam into a rumor of distant markets, which was sometimes all a winter needed. Perfume performed the way good manners do noticed if absent, sustaining when present. Scent traveled in fibers. Wool kept it the way it keeps heat, grudgingly at first, then forever. Fur liked stronger notes. Linen preferred green ones. A household learned its palate by trial and cough. A sachet that pleased everyone lived in the closed chest and achieved elder status. One that started arguments found exile behind the door. Men who spent weeks at sea returned smelling like tar salt and very faintly of the sachet that had waited in their traveling. Box domesticity in a key so minor, you might miss it if you were busy and perfect, if you were resting. Micro hook, because small facts are friendly. Excavations have turned up lumps of tar used to waterproof ships, and nearby little bags of herbs. Maintenance for vessels, maintenance for people, stored on the same shelf. Mythology took note. Gods who governed weather and luck were expected to enjoy offerings that didn't arrive with yesterday still on them. Before sacrifice, hands were washed, faces were rinsed. Hair was straightened into the kind of order that reads as respect even to deities who, technically, can see through skin. The bowl by the temple entrance, filled and refilled with water that remembered cold streams, advertised seriousness the way good shoes advertise a long walk. Cleanliness interlocked with purity without demanding perfection. People who worked with fish, tar, and iron forgave each other the honest smells of the day. But when the moment demanded clear speech oath-taking vows, the first taste of beer at a feast water reset the needle to zero. Some stories hint at a figure who minds the borders between dirt and order, a household spirit of the clean threshold. It is not a thunder god or a giant. It is more like a caretaker who notices if the bowl by the door has gone dry, who approves of hot stones added at the right moment, who perhaps nudges a comb back onto its peg. Myth is often a formal way of praising routine. You may call it a god if you like. Your grandmother might call it good habits. Either way, the offering looks the same. Wash before you speak, straighten your shirt before you ask for a favor. Keep the soap pot clean on the outside as well as the inside because virtue gets nervous around sticky lids. The paradox that began our meander warriors with weekly baths does not feel like a paradox from the inside. It is simply a strategy for staying comfortable in a climate that can make even a sturdy mood brittle. Hot water takes a complicated day and sands it smooth. A comb resets the head like a plumb line resets a wall. The weekly rhythm keeps time when the sun refuses to. If cleanliness improved marriage prospects and trading profits, that was a bonus the way warm bread is a bonus to flour. The point most weeks was less heroic, to feel less like a collection of pieces and more like one person arranged on purpose. And so the scene winds down the way a bath loses steam. Saturday steps back into the week. Water darkens the soil where buckets were emptied. Soap goes to sleep under its lid with the due satisfaction of a job done. Combs dry on a windowsill like small, well-behaved animals sunning themselves. Shirts pretend to be flags a little longer. Outside, the wind resumes writing the long letter it started in autumn, Inside, somebody oils the hinge of a chest so the sachets won't be startled. Next week, the stones will be reheated, the kettle persuaded, the stick consulted, and the same slow choreography will repeat: detail, depth, a soft smile at the precise part in a beard, and then a gentle drift outward toward ordinary chores and the pleasant fatigue that makes beds more persuasive than stories. You might not expect a culture famous for swinging axes to reserve an entire weekday for warm water and conversation, but the North always enjoyed a practical paradox. In villages ringed with frost and sea salt wind, the week moved toward washing the way rivers move toward the sea inevitably and a little proudly. The word for it sat right in the calendar like a discreet label on a jar: Lagerdagger, the bathing day. It was less an event than a tide that locals scheduled life around. By mid-morning on a winter Saturday, smoke from heating stones rose in patient columns, tubs sweated like well-fed oxen, and paths through snow narrowed to the communal house where steam had the persuasive tone of a kindly elder. If you remain awake by the time I begin describing ear spoons, the smallest celebrity of the archaeological recur, you're welcome to subscribe. If you drift off before that, consider it a vote of confidence in hot water as a concept. The weekly wash began with a geography lesson. Bathing places were not dramatic temples of marble. They were turf-roofed rooms, sunk into earth, warmed by stones that had heard entire families argue gently about temperature. Water was hauled in sloshing pails by people who could carry 2 conversations in 2 buckets at once. A neighbor stirred the bath like a stew, testing heat with a stick that always had a name: old alder or burned scar or something equally affectionate. Children were assigned important jobs, such as counting ladles, reporting loudly on steam levels, and pretending the tubs were ships. Someone, usually a methodical aunt, managed the rhythm: clothes on pegs, soap next to the bench, combs, and a well-behaved line. The soundtrack was not chanting, but the soft civic music of living. Water poured, joke told, bucket set down in a place it had been set down for years. If cleanliness is next to godliness, Saturday politely sat in the same pew. Language preserved the habit with a stubbornness that would make a monk smile. As Christianity relabeled feasts and kings relabeled taxes, the bathing day kept its etymology like a scent in wool. That tenacity tells us 2 things. First, that people like the feeling of being acoustically clean saying the word that still carries the steam of its origin. Second, that routines survive because nothing argues against them. Warm water, yes. The company of neighbors, yes. Emerging with the week's dust politely erased, yes. One can picture a visitor asking, "Why Saturday?" and receiving a shrug that means because Friday had other responsibilities and Sunday is busy with sermons. Calendars and kettles agree more often than you think. The tools of this tidy world were humble and a little elegant. Soap was not a blockbuster purchase, but a slow kitchen project. Fat rendered gently until it remembered nothing of the animal. Ashes leached for lye that looked like humble tea and behaved like conviction. The 2 coaxed together with a paddle claimed by tradition and sternly kept away from porridge. The smell of fresh soap announced itself like rain on stone clean without being glamorous. When trade routes were kind, someone added crushed juniper or a thread of imported resin so faint that it felt like a rumor. Soap did not try to be a perfume. Its job was to make dirt reconsider its life choices. Combs, by contrast, liked a little attention. Antler lent them a satin sturdiness. Wood gave warmth. Bone added a satisfying weight. Archaeologists keep finding combs carved with tiny zigzags and quiet circles. Decorations not meant to impress strangers, but to gratify the hand that turned them. The teeth were cut with a precision that suggests the maker knew exactly how stubborn hair can be in a wind that thinks it is in charge. A good comb warmed in the palm, remembered the direction a braid wanted to lie, and forgave its owner for days when the sea bullied everything into a gusty arrangement. Tweezers kept company with the comb, efficient little calamari of bronze or iron, there to insist that straight lines feel better than weeds. And then there were the ear spoons, miniature ladles hung on rings with seals and keys, proof that even in a heroic age, someone cared deeply about the quiet dignity of an untroubled ear. People carried entire grooming kits the way merchants carry measures, which says something about priorities. In the North, neatness was a portable virtue. Soap had seasons. In summer, it softened immediately, obligingly foaming as if showing off for daylight. In winter, it required a negotiation conducted over hot stones and patient stirring, and even then it sometimes sulked. Families placed soap in lidded boxes lined with linen, the fabric faintly aromatic from years of storing herbs. When a new batch worked, a household nodded with the shared relief of farmers watching bread rise. When a batch misbehaved, there were jokes you could hear from the next dead over. At least it will keep demons from the door, someone would say, and the soap, being pure chemistry, declined to comment. Public perception of all this tidiness blended admiration with a hint of complaint, especially in the writing of neighbors who recorded the North the way one records weather, soberly and with an umbrella. Monastic chroniclers shook their heads at men who changed shirts more often than the storybook barbarian is supposed to. They wrote about combed hair with the same tone used for unseasonal blossoms. The quiet implication that cleanliness makes a better first impression than conquest crept into diplomacy. A visiting trader whose beard obeyed geometry was assumed to have honest scales. A man who smelled faintly of soap rather than of yesterday's voyage found bargaining partners more amenable. If the marriage market tilted toward the groom who arrived with clean fingernails and the bride whose hair celebrated symmetry, the sources do not gloat. They merely note it the way one notes favorable winds in towns where winter lingers and daylight forgets its appointments. Grooming became a stubborn form of optimism. Before courts convened, beards were trimmed to legal length, as if justice appreciates tidy margins. Before assemblies, tunics were shaken free of the small biographies that collect on cloth. A comb passed between friends like a communal argument settled in favor of order. Small laws protected hair from pranksters. Somewhere, some decade, a haircut acquired during an ale-inspired joke turned to litigation, and legislators dutifully wrote, "Please don't." Even without statutes, reputation handled enforcement. A person who neglected washing for too long reported that fact ahead of themselves like a herald. No one. Hired. Ritual gathered around bathing almost automatically. Before weddings, families heated the bathhouse as if warming a guest room for joy. Everyone went in and came out carrying the same color in their cheeks, which made introductions easy. The bride's hair went up in a pattern that required at least 3 opinions and a final vote, and the groom's beard was persuaded to show its best arithmetic. Nearby, a bucket of cold water stood guard like a stern aunt to discourage leisure when other people were waiting. The bathhouse offered a rehearsal for the feast. People practiced courtesy in steam and then performed it in lamplight. Archaeological layers sometimes preserve bathhouses near halls, as if community prefers to move between warmth and warmth with only the softest of thresholds. Gender negotiated its own quiet rules. In some places and times, men and women bathed separately. Elsewhere, the timing softened to family units, a choreography learned more from common sense than from edict. Privacy was a curtain that everyone agreed to respect without dramatizing it. We picture baskets of clean cloth waiting in doorways, someone checking the temperature of the kettle with a practiced foot, the edge of a tub smoothed by a century of elbows. The social miracle is not that anyone bathed. It is that the weekly wash took the edginess out of winter and turned whispered gossip into the steam's property instead of the neighbor's. If you're still awake, a small hook to reward your persistence, Some bathhouses used peat to heat stones, which gave the air a quiet earth smell, as though the soil had decided to hum along. Beyond the baths, scent threaded itself into cloth and memory. Juniper berries, veteran travelers of northern kitchens, were tucked into small linen sachets that perfumed chests like modest promises. Angelica root offered a green note, and imported resins like frankincense arrived in quantities so tiny that they felt like secrets traded in markets of sun and dust. Scent did not walk ahead of a person. It accompanied them like a polite friend who closes doors softly. Wool held these notes with great patience, releasing them when garments warmed on shoulders. Linen preferred fresher tones. Fur requested stronger ones and kept them like folklore. Open a chest after a season and the room relearned last summer. Trade routes stitched this softness to a larger world. A ship returned from the south, not only with bright cloth and stories about roofs that never saw snow, but also with a tiny vial that could turn steam into a foreign country for the length of a song. The vial lived wrapped in wool, attended by the household like a pet. A single drop in a basin made the room smell like market stalls born of heat olive wood, baked bricks, something citrus that had never met a fjord. In hard winters, that was a kind of medicine. In summer, it was a bragging right the size of a grain of barley. Scent wasn't a luxury so much as a reminder that far places are real and that the world is larger than weather. Myth met maintenance at the threshold. The sagas did not list the god of soap, though one suspects such a figure would be stern and carry a paddle. Still, purity before sacrifice and oath appears as a recurring courtesy. A bowl at a shrine, refilled with clear water, invited hands to remember streams. Hair was straightened because respect prefers even lines. At the feast hall, a wash basin traveled the benches with the same gravitas as the horn. Cleanliness in these scenes is not moralized. It is simply dignified, the physical tone of taking something seriously. The North understood that the gods, if they were watching, appreciated effort more than theater, and warm water counts as effort in February. Households turned this into quiet theology. Some spoke of a house spirit who noticed if the bathhouse was swept. A domestic intelligence that approved of dry floors and combs returned to their pegs. Whether spirit or habit, the effect was identical. The tools lived close to where they were used. The water pail was never allowed to sulk empty by the door, and the soapbox's lid closed snugly against mice with curious tastes. In a climate where chaos likes to blow through gaps, tidiness became weatherproofing for the soul. The reward was not dramatic. It was simply the relief of clean skin under clean cloth, and the way sleep arrives faster when you smell, very faintly, like juniper and warm stone. The Viking bathing paradox resolves itself when you listen to the weak exhale. Warriors needn't choose between ferocity and fresh shirts. Traders can carry scales and sachets on the same ring. Families who build ships strong enough to cross seas can also build routines strong enough to cross winters. Steam rises. Combs whisper through beards with geometric satisfaction. A law code somewhere quietly specifies that cutting another man's hair without consent will cost you silver and embarrassment. Saturday grows contented and round, like a kettle left just off the boil. And as evening moves in with the slow confidence of a well-known song, people step from the bathhouse into the cold, heat banked on skin, the week neatly reset. The tubs cool. The stones crackle as they do when they have told their story. Soap dries into the calm of its box. In the hush that follows, you can almost hear the calendar turning itself carefully toward next time. You might not expect a week to have a smell, but in the north it did. It smelled faintly of wet wool, hot stone, and the agreeable honesty of clean skin. The week wandered through fishing and weaving and mending nets until it arrived at its predictable conclusion. Warm water in a room designed to fog your thoughts until even the sharpest gossip softened at the edges. The word for the day came along like a label stitched to a sleeve locker digger. The bathing day, so that every time someone asked what day it was, they answered with a tiny to-do list. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe in a way that requires minimal movement, or do nothing at all and let the steam handle your administrative life. The tubs won't mind. They are busy remembering last week that the place where Saturday happened was surprisingly practical. A bathhouse looked like a hill that had changed its mind and become a room. Turf walls kept wind busy somewhere else. The doorway was short enough to encourage humility. Inside, benches ran along the walls as if the building wanted to sit down too. Stones were heated until they crackled. Water sighed across them and forgot it had ever been sharp ice. The light was low on purpose so that smoke and steam could practice their joint handwriting under the rafters. People moved as if they had done this hundreds of times, which, given the age of the habit, is statistically certain. Someone always arrived early to coax the fire. Someone always lingered at the end to empty a last ladle and say, "There, that's the week." A visiting stranger might expect raucous singing. Instead, the room preferred soft talk, the kind that can happen only when everyone is slightly pink and too relaxed to be. Ambitious dot tools waited with an air of unobtrusive competence. A soapbox sat on a shelf, carved soft stone, smooth as a river pebble, in which a pale, homely soap resided like a quiet magistrate. Making it had taken time. Animal fat traveled from kitchen to kettle. Ashes were persuaded to part with their lie. Everything simmered while a member of the household stirred with a stick that had sworn an oath never to touch porridge. When the mixture cooled, someone added a gesture of juniper or strips of wind-dried kelp, because even virtue enjoys a hobby. The result cleaned without drama. It did not pretend to be oranges or mountains or ships. It smelled like done. Around it lay combs of antler with teeth cut so evenly that archaeologists still hold them up to the light and nod. A good comb could outlive 2 owners and 3 arguments. Tweezers rested nearby, shaped like tiny herons. And hanging from a ring was the most patient instrument of all, the ear spoon, small, curved, convinced that life improves when the inner world stops tickling. In an age famous for axes, the museum cases quietly reveal a people equally proud of tiny spoons designed for ears. It's a comforting contradiction, like a dragon hoarding thimbles. The routine had choreography. Clothes were hung on pegs, known to the household by touch alone. Hairpins were counted, not because they were rare, but because a lost hairpin will occupy the mind for days, especially when you are trying to be brave about snow. Soap traveled from palm to palm like a mild sermon. Children learned the temperature of the water from the expressions of their elders. You could measure a family's closeness by the amount of polite teasing they could fit into a single rinsing. Someone inevitably told the story of the time a rush of cold air doused the stones, and the room collectively hissed at winter until it retreated a little. The bathhouse was not a social club, yet it accomplished the same thing that clubs promised neighbors reappeared as humans rather than as occupations. Shepherds were no longer just the people who smelled like sheep. They were the people whose hands held combs with surprising gentleness. Language kept the habit filed neatly in the calendar. Lagerdigger did not shout about hygiene. It whispered it at the pace of a week. That whisper drifted into other tongues as Saturday, a name most of us say without noticing the weight it carries. The way one uses a door handle every day without remembering the first time it clicked. There are places where words for days come from gods, planets, or numbers. In the north, at least for a while, one day came from warm water. This did more than label time. It told everyone what a reasonable life should include, the way a pantry shelf tells you what kind of soup you will inevitably make. The day reminded you to be civil to your hair and kinder to your neighbors. If a sailor missed a week because the sea borrowed him too long, The first thing he asked after stepping ashore was not news of politics, but the condition of the bathhouse roof. The kit that made all of this possible traveled with people into the grave. That is how we know so much. Archaeologists open a burial mound as carefully as one opens a letter, and inside they find a small bundle, comb, tweezers, sometimes a razor, and the multi-tool ring where keys jingle with ear spoons and chatty charms. The comb teeth may be worn on one side, the side that attacked a favorite cowlick every morning. Tweezers grip the centuries with a precise little bite. A razor promises, with heroic optimism, to tame beards that had intellectual positions on wind. The message from the dead is calm. I was a person who liked to be presentable. People say the Vikings were fierce. The artifacts say they were tidy enough to be fierce, with clean edges. Soap dash making had its seasons like fishing or haying. In late spring, the fat left from winter's butchery had the right mood. Ashes from the hearth obeyed just enough. Water remembered being glacier and tried to act wise. The pot came forward and acquired respectability for a day. While it bubbled, someone told the story of the time a batch went stubborn and had to be convinced with extra ash and a threat to make it listen to the sagas. There were recipes, but they were not read. They were behaved. When a batch came out right, an entire household experienced the petty, perfect triumph of a clean shirt drying by the door. On market days, bars of soap traveled wrapped in cloth like small secrets. They were traded for things with more bragging rights, but no one doubted which would be used first. The cleanliness produced a reputation that traveled faster than ships. Chroniclers and cloisters wrote with a tone of resigned admiration about people who washed more than was strictly necessary for a good sermon. Some accounts claim northerners combed their hair every day and changed shirts more than once a week, a fact that upset certain monks the way spring mud upsets a procession. The complaints themselves are revealing. If adversaries grumble that you are too neat, you have probably won the argument in a quiet way. On trading wharves, a braid that lay obediently in a line was a kind of credential. A seller whose fingernails looked like he belonged to his wares rather than to his boat inspired confidence. There are limits. No amount of soap will fix a crooked scale, but a comb can go a long way toward making haggling humane. The marriage market noticed. Sagas don't linger on baths because heroes prefer to be introduced through storms and speeches. But every wedding hides a logistical miracle. Someone acquired enough hot water, enough clean linen, enough combs to negotiate hair that had its own map. Families heated the bathhouse like an oven on a festival day. The bride's hair was arranged with ceremony. The groom's beard discovered its geometry. Mothers judged quietly which is their right. In the corner, a bucket of cold water waited as a timekeeper, reminding everyone that other households also wished to be beautiful. Afterward, the room smelled like steam that had learned to sing. If there were tears, they were easier to hide in the fog. Law took an interest in grooming, as law eventually takes interest in anything humans do often enough to irritate one another. Somewhere in the north, a code spelled out a fine for cutting another person's hair without consent. The existence of this rule suggests that at least one festival ended with too much ale and a prank that grew up to become legislation. The penalty, typically silver or its equivalent, turned out to be the price of not laughing in court. The rule carried a larger point. Hair mattered because reputations wore it. You can measure a culture by the mischief it considers serious. Perfume in this world was less a luxury than an accent. Cloth that had met juniper or birch resin behind a closed chest carried a scent like a polite footnote. You noticed it only when a wearer warmed, the way sunlight discovers dust motes and turns them into theater. Women stitched small sachets of crushed herbs and hung them from belts the way we clip keys. A tunic pulled from storage refused to smell like storage. It smelled like a forest that told fewer stories than it could. When trade cooperated, a vial of frankincense or myrrh came north the way a rumor comes north slowly, watched by everyone. A single drop in the bathhouse changed steam into distant markets for the duration of one long breath. It's difficult to prove that scent improved negotiation, but it likely did. People are kinder to prices when their clothes are quietly telling them that the world is complicated and interesting. Mythology did not appoint a god of soap, although one imagines such a figure carrying the paddle and speaking with the patient firmness of someone who has reminded the same household for 3 generations to keep the soap box closed. Still, ritual expected cleanliness the way doors expect hinges. Before sacrifices or oaths, hands met water because honesty prefers to arrive without crumbs. At feasts, a basin moved from guest to guest, and the towel followed like a well-behaved dog. The combination of religion and rinsing is not about purity in the theatrical sense. It is about comfort. The gods, if they were attending, could take no offense at warmth. And if the gods were busy elsewhere, the people at least had clean hands before eating. That is a kind of miracle you can rely on. Construction details drift through the written sources the way sawdust drifts through sunlight. A bathhouse often borrowed heat from an adjoining room, a thrifty arrangement that wrapped work around comfort. A drain ran under the floor to report to the ground. Roof beams were the thick kind that do not mind getting damp. In summer, doors were propped to invite birdsong. In winter, everyone became a bird themselves, hopping from hot bench to colder floor to hot bench again, testing the limits of their own patience. You learn to judge exact water temperature by its sound on stones, a skill as satisfying as reading a friend's mood by the way they say your name. When the last bucket emptied, someone wiped the benches with a rag that had lived its former life as a proud shirt. Objects in the north were allowed second careers. This attention to washing did not mean people spent hours a day polishing themselves like silver. They were busy, but the small routines added up like coins in a jar. A quick comb while the porridge thought about being porridge. A swipe of the face after a cold walk. An inspection of a child's ears with the instrument that, even now, makes museum visitors smile. The cumulative result was not flamboyant beauty. It was simple dignity. Hair that stays braided in a headwind is confident. A beard that agrees with the jawline suggests a mind that can negotiate with weather and win most days. Even in travel, the kit adapted. A trader on the rivers of the east carried a comb that folded like a bridge. A raider, if we must use the dramatic word, kept tweezers tucked into a pouch where amulets also lived, because both promise a kind of control. The ear spoon stayed on the ring because suddenly losing such a thing in a foreign land would feel like forgetting the shape of your own name. On board ship, water was precious, but a handful on the face at dawn counted as a greeting not only to the day, but to oneself. If you're thinking this sounds like modern camping advice, you are right. History's toiletries kit evolves at the speed of a bucket. Neighbors across the water, especially in Anglo-Saxon towns, noticed and wrote about it with a mixture of reluctance and curiosity. They washed to steal our daughters, runs one defensive summary. This suggests that grooming, not swords, was the alarming technology. If the accusation sounds absurd, that is because it is also honest. A comb can be a diplomatic instrument. To complain that your rivals are too clean is to concede that they are good at first impressions. And first impressions are the doorways of alliances. Somewhere, a bishop trying to write a stern letter had to pause because the messenger smelled faintly of juniper, and the room suddenly felt friendly. At the end of Saturday, the bathhouse did what buildings do when people leave. It held the shape of them for a while and then released it. Stones cooled, clicking to themselves like insects with sleepy opinions. The soap sat drying in its box, practicing virtue. Combs returned to their pouch with the satisfied air of tools that have done their arithmetic correctly. Outside, the air decided to be colder than a story should be, and inside, everyone found the particular relief of clean cloth on clean skin, the kind of comfort too basic to brag about and too important to ignore. Children were quieter than usual because warmth persuades the body to whisper. Elders stretched and remembered other Saturdays in other rooms and pronounced them all essentially the same, which was praise. Thus the paradox dissolves. People whose boats shook the edge of maps also kept ear spoons on their key rings. The difference is not a contradiction. It is the daily ratio that keeps humans plausible. You can knit a sail and knit a family habit of washing without experiencing moral strain. You can maintain a sword and a comb with the same attention to metal teeth. The week rolls forward and stops respectfully at its warm doorstep. The door opens. Steam says hello. Someone laughs softly at a joke they have told for decades, because jokes used in steam do not wear out. If you're still listening, the bathhouse is ready again next week, and the week after, until language itself retires to the shelf beside the soap. The calendar keeps its appointment, and you, wrapped in a shirt that smells faintly of resin and patience, will sleep as if the stones are still radiating calm. You might not expect a calendar to carry a faint scent that the northern week did, as if time itself had been stored in a wooden chest with juniper twigs. It moved along through hauling nets and mending sails, through arguments with weather and sheep, and then it arrived at its predictable fragrance: warm stone, wet wool, a tidy hush. The day had a name that doubled as instructions loggered ever. The bathing day, and it behaved like a note penned to the week, saying gently, "Please rinse. If you're still awake by the time we get to the part about ear spoons, you're welcome to subscribe by thinking the word later at a comfortable speed. But truly, don't strain anything. This is a program that functions best with loose muscles and an unambitious pillow. The bathhouse never tried to be grand. From a distance, it looked like a hill that had politely learned geometry. Turf tucked itself over beams. Smoke threaded out through a vent that kept secrets poorly. Inside, benches ran along the walls, the way a sentence runs along a line calmly, with somewhere to sit at the end. Stones were heated until they whispered. Water fell on them and invented a small private climate where voices used their indoor opinions. Someone always arrived first because fire was not self-starter in this century, and someone always left last, wiping benches with a rag that remembered being a proud shirt. People came in the practical order of a household: elders, children, whoever had the most nettle stings that week, then the rest. Modesty was observed in the way people observe doorways carefully, because foreheads remember. The room smelled like steam that had read sagas and decided not to share the exciting parts. Tools waited with that unshowy competence that makes archaeologists nod. The soap sat in a shallow soft stone box, pale and homely, like a minor moon the household kept indoors. It had been boiled from animal fat and lye coaxed out of ashes, a recipe that makes romance step aside so chemistry can wave. The stick used to stir it possessed a ceremonial title, not for porridge. When the mixture cooled, it was sometimes fragranced with juniper shavings or crushed angelica, not to impress visitors, but to remind storage chests to smell like forests rather than like long plans. Nearby lay combs carved from antler, teeth so even they looked like orderly snowfall. They were surprisingly social tools. A comb could be borrowed the way we borrow a sentence and return a person to themselves. Tweezers rested politely on a ring tiny instruments for the heroic battle against the single hair that had declared independence. And dangling beside them, the star of the quiet show, a small curved ear spoon, shaped like a shy crescent, convinced that life improves when tickles retire. In museums, these spoons sit behind glass, still looking helpful. You can almost hear them ask if anyone needs a gentle moment. The choreography was steady. Clothes came off in a layered geography: outer tunic, inner tunic, The shirt that emits soap this week and wanted that known. Hairpins were accounted for with the solemnity of coins. Water discussed temperature with hands in one. A grandmother demonstrated the proper method for pouring a ladle, so the steam rose like polite applause. Children learned to read adults by the microflinch that means too hot without the drama. People teased as softly as steam, the kind of teasing that contains the line, "You'll never get that braid to behave if you keep encouraging it." Someone inevitably retold the story of the time a goat trotted in by mistake and settled on the warmest spot, which is exactly what a sensible goat would do. The door flapped briefly, invited winter to look, and closed against it again, as if the building had a courteous bouncer. Words carried the habit forward. Laugerdegger drifted into other languages, and by a chain of quiet accidents, became Saturday in many mouths, so ordinary now that we don't notice we're saying Bath Day to one another every week. It's like using a spoon carved from the moon and calling it cutlery, which is technically safe but spiritually unobservant. In the North, the name reminded everyone that cleanliness could be communal without being ceremonial. It asked for nothing extravagant, just a reasonable relationship with water. The day made people tidier and kinder, and the week, feeling appreciated, decided to repeat the kit did not live only on shelves. It traveled into graves with the calm persistence of a habit. Open a burial, and you often find a little bundle of future museum labels: comb, tweezers, razor, the key ring with its small lunar ear spoon. The comb teeth might be worn on the side that attacked a stubborn cowlick since adolescence. The razor might promise with endearing optimism to make a beard obey wind. The tweezers still look ready to pluck the universe into a better order, one tiny rebellion at a time. Even in death, people wanted to meet the next world looking like themselves, and not like someone who had been cornered by mossed-out soap dash making, had a season and a mood. When ashes were plentiful and fat had stopped pretending it had other plans, pots came forward with the gravitas of judges. Lice seeped from ash like carefully brewed stern advice. Fat melted down its stubbornness. The mixture bubbled as though contemplating philosophy. A house could tell you whether a batch was going well by the sound it made when a cold spoon tested it, and by how the dog decided to sit. When it sat, someone scratched a mark in the cooling surface, a sun, a rune, a practical line that said, "Use this side," on market days. Bars wrapped in cloth changed hands for wool. Fish hooks, gossip. Soap traveled slowly, but improved everything it met, which is more than we can say for most celebrities. Appearance mattered because other people have eyes, and because wind tangles hair with dedicated artistry. A smooth braid was a small claim to dignity in a world that did not distribute dignity fairly. Beards were trimmed to look intentional rather than accidental, and there was a quiet hierarchy of tools as complex as any ranking of swords. The man with the fine-toothed comb and the patient ear spoon radiated the kind of reliability you want in a person who is allowed near your property lines. You can take the measure of a culture by the objects that survive it. In this case, the artifacts suggest a collective preference for tidy edges and gentle repairs. For beauty administered in small daily teaspoons, neighbors noticed. Across the water, clerics wrote as if composing letters to a stern uncle, but could not help admitting that the northerners washed. Some said they combed daily, changed shirts frequently, and arranged hair in ways that suspiciously improved courtship outcomes. A famous complaint accuses them of stealing wives and daughters, which is a moral panic you can only write if you suspect equal shampoo access is skewing the market. It's telling that the criticism isn't about swords or feasts, but about being presentable. First impressions are infrastructure. Clean linen is diplomacy in cotton form. In a dockside negotiation, a seller whose beard looked recently convinced could find prices softening like butter near the hearth. There are many forms of power. One of them is not smelling like you've lost an argument with fish. Weddings use these truths like clean tools. Before a feast, a family created a temporary spa industry. The bathhouse transformed into a warm cloud where braids were rehearsed, beards chose a governing philosophy, and every hairpin was promoted to a role with a title. Cold water waited in a bucket like a chaperone. Someone sang while someone else counted towels. The bride's hair was long, arithmetic. The groom's beard was brought to heel like a wandering sheep. Grandmothers remembered a greater heat from a bath long ago, unprovable but certain. When they emerged, the whole household smelled gently of soap and steam and intention. Archaeology agrees. The bathhouse appears in saga margins right where weddings occur, because love and hot water both prefer a schedule.law wandered in, as it does, to organize the more excitable outcomes. Somewhere, someone wrote that cutting another person's hair without permission carried a fine. The existence of this rule suggests at least one festival ended with ale, creative shears, and mourning regret. Silver compensated the injured hairstyle. Order was satisfied. It's an excellent example of how community standards evolve. If you have to legislate against prank haircuts, it means everybody understands hair is not merely decoration, it's biography written in keratin, which is why combs were guarded like portable reputations. Perfume did not arrive in carved crystal, it arrived in cloth. Herbs were dried and crushed into small sachets that lived among shirts, so that the garment you pulled from a chest smelled faintly of forest in summer rather than chest in winter. Juniper was popular. Birch resin tried its best. Angelica contributed a note that made memories think kindly. When trade cooperated, rarer scents traveled from the south in tiny vials with big stories attached. A single drop in the bath turned steam into distant markets, long enough for every nose to become cosmopolitan. These were not loud fragrances. They were shy, following warmth like polite shadows, the kind of scent you notice only when you're already comfortable and therefore receptive to compliments from air. Mythology didn't appoint a deity of soap. If it had, the god would have been patient, fond of ladles, and perpetually damp around the elbows. But ritual expected cleanliness the way doors expect hinges. Before oaths, hands met water. Before sacrifices, faces were washed. Not because the gods demanded fainting couch purity, but because honesty likes to arrive unsticky. A basin traveled around a hall like a rumor with good manners. Even the biggest storytellers paused to dry their fingers. Cleanliness in these moments was less about moral staging and more about comfort becoming formality. The gods, if present, noticed the courtesy. If absent, the people at least ate with clean hands, which is a kind of piety you can prove. Architecture helped the habit succeed. Bathhouses were usually attached to rooms already interested in heat. Kitchens, weaving rooms, places where people had learned to coax warmth from reluctant days. A channel under the floor persuaded water to leave without conversation. Roof beams had resigned themselves to hard work. In summer, doors stood open and birdsong came in to see what the fuss was about. In winter, the door became strategic, opening only so much as to let a body inside and not one molecule more. A person learned to judge water by sound angry hiss for too hot, cheerful murmur for perfect, sulky drip for not quite. It's the same skill used today to evaluate coffee, which proves that progress is really just hot water applied to different substances. Travel adopted the kit. Traders carried folding combs that behaved like minor miracles of answer engineering. Raiders, if we must use the dramatic word, kept tweezers in ear spoons and pouches, alongside amulets because both reassure the mind in different registers. On ships, fresh water was precious, but a handful flung at dawn onto a face counted as a conversation with the day. The sea wind braided hair for free, and not always in compliance. The comb filed appeals. When camps were made, Someone always scouted for a stream with the seriousness of supply officers. If none could be found, Snow qualified after certain stern instructions. The wider world balanced admiration with suspicion. Clean shirts were read as ambition. A tidy beard was blamed for persuasive proposals. Some towns even adopted Saturday bathing themselves, proof that habits skip borders the way cats skip fences silently once they know the height. A monk copied a complaint, and in doing so preserved evidence of a cross-cultural grooming arms race no one planned. Meanwhile, at home, the routine continued. Saturday came. Stones heated, bench rags remembered former careers, and the population of the bathhouse increased by exactly the correct number until calm achieved quorum. At day's end, the place performed its closing ritual. Steam unthreaded itself and went to rest in the rafters. Stones clicked cool, tiny hands of heat letting go their grip on air. The soap lay drying in its box like a tiny moon in its last quarter. Combs slid back into their leather sheath with the satisfied click of tools that have finished their math. The door opened to let darkness look in and closed again to keep warmth from exploring. People returned to shirts that had met Juniper and therefore claimed distant cousins. Beds greeted bodies that were, for once, all the same comfortable temperature. You cannot place such comfort on a map, but you can locate it exactly on the human face. All of this creates the pleasant contradiction we keep circling. The same culture that explored rivers and sea lanes and acquired a reputation for rowdiness also established a weekly appointment with hot water and decency. The same rings that carried house keys carried ear spoons. The same hands that set sail braided daughter's hair with patience honed by wind knots. There is no dissonance here, only scale. People who make big waves often appreciate small order. The week, grateful for a day that smelled faintly of forest and patience, kept repeating itself. So the calendar turns, and Saturday continues to arrive under new spellings, wearing the same quiet instructions. Somewhere, water moves onto stones and becomes weather you can hold. Somewhere, a comb takes a stubborn thought out of hair and makes space for sleep. If you're still awake, that is perfectly fine. The bench is warm for as long as you like. The steam understands unhurried decisions. And the clean, modest world that waits at the other end of a ladle is patient, breathing softly through the hours, content to see you drift. You might not expect the weekday to tell you when to wash, but in the north it did, in a voice as calm as warm water. The name that slid through mouths like a round pebble lager doggerment bath day, and it sat at the end of the week like a reminder pinned to a woolen sleeve. Not Thunder Day, not War Day, not Tax Day, just a polite appointment with steam. If you find your eyes relaxing already, that's perfectly within regulations. And if, against all odds, you're still awake after we drift past the part about ear spoons, you can subscribe by whispering later to the nearest towel. But please don't move. Stillness Assists History. Saturday, the bath day, arrived with the slow reliability of a well-behaved tide. The bathhouse wasn't grand. It was a hill that had learned to breathe. Turf layered its shoulders, smoke stitched upward, and a door remembered to close itself quickly in winter. Inside, benches lined the walls like commas small pauses where you could sit before continuing. Stones grew hot until they stopped pretending they were cold. Water fell on them and invented weather. Voices traded volume for warmth. Everyone used their indoor opinions. No one hurried because nothing in the room believed in haste. The heat had a soft edge. Soap smelled faintly of animal and ash because it was exactly that animal fat boiled with lye coax from wood ashes, a recipe that made chemistry proud and romance excuse itself for a walk. Lagerdugger didn't scold. It only said, in the tone of someone who knows the sensible answer, that time goes better when people are rinsed. The ritual was organized by households, which were tiny governments with one rule. The person with the ladle speaks last. Elders went first, then children, because bones have opinions and children have mud. Modesty was observed with the same common sense that keeps foreheads from meeting door frames. Hairpins were counted in and counted out like minor nobility. A grandmother checked heat with a professional squint and that brief intake of breath that means, this will be perfect in one ladle. People teased each other gently. Someone told the traditional tale of the goat who entered during a windstorm and chose the warmest spot. A story supported by the truth that goats always choose the warmest spot. Nobody remembered when the tale began. It had just always been there, like steamed-out words traveled farther than boats. Lagerdecker sauntered into other languages until, by a long chain of vowel adjustments and calendar negotiations, it prepared to introduce itself as Saturday in many places. The meaning faded into familiarity, as meanings prefer to do, but it stayed pressed into the week like a thumbprint. That is why, when you say Saturday, you are also faintly saying bath day, which is one of those tiny facts that reorders nothing and improves everything. On bath day, the town smelled different. Wool opened its fibers. Hair forgave wind. A person stepping outside into cold air felt the sting on their cheeks and judged it acceptable. The door, flatteringly surprised by the number of visitors, behaved like a courteous bouncer. Tools shaped the habit. They waited on a shelf with the unshowy competence of objects that do not require speeches. The comb was carved from antler or bone, teeth so regular they looked like a tiny fence protecting a meadow from chaos. Museum combs today still carry the beautiful absence of snarls. Tweezers hung on a ring like attentive eyebrows. A small razor lay beside them, practicing humility with a single iron grin. And then the ear spoon, the smallest crescent moon in the house, a tool wholly devoted to the soft ending of tickles. It wasn't dramatic. You wouldn't build a saga around it, but you would sleep better if it had done its quiet work. Soap, when it was made at home, required a certain mood from the weather and a certain patience from the household. Lye dripped cautiously through a filter of ash into a bucket that was not used for drinking under any circumstances, no matter how persuasive thirst became. Animal fat melted in a pot and remembered past lives. When combined, the mixture behaved like a discussion in which both parties agreed gradually. A relative stirred with a stick that had an implicit name, not for porridge. Bubbles told you whether the batch was cheerful, and the dog told you whether the smell was encouraging. When the mixture thickened, it was poured into shallow softstone boxes and allowed to become a bar, which, as every bar knows, is only a helpful shape. Later, a pinch of juniper shavings might be pressed into it, not to impress visitors, though it did, but to persuade chests and cupboards to smell, like brief forests rather than long winters. The bathhouse sounded busy and looked calm. Water hissed on stones with that little angry sigh that means, sure, pour. Heat traveled like a tide across the room. The ladle scraped the tub in a rhythm that would be called music if it were less useful. An ant braided hair with the same concentration used for mending nets. Somewhere a child played the game of balancing a comb on a knee and pretending to be a law court. An older man placed coins on the bench to keep track of who had used which ladle in which order, a system no one needed and everyone respected. From outside, you could hear the snow making its dry whisper against turf. Inside, Skin discovered that world history might be wrong about hardship, at least for the next hour. Grooming did not end at the door. The same kit traveled with people the way sentences travel in memory. We know this because graves kept receipts. Archaeologists open a burial and find a small biography. Comb, tweezers, razor, ear spoon, perhaps a little case where oil once lived. You can tell from the wear on a comb which corner of the head always rebelled. You can tell from the polish on the tweezers that one person in the household valued the microscopic neatness of eyebrows. These artifacts say something steady, Cleanliness was not a luxury. It was how you greeted the day. Even death made room for the idea that meeting the next world with combed hair was a kind of etiquette distant neighbors noticed. Anglo-Saxon writers, who had sharp quills and longer winters than they preferred, recorded that northerners washed often, wore clean linen, and adjusted their hair with suspicious competence. The complaint that these visitors stole wives and daughters reads less like a police report and more like an economic forecast. In any market, the freshly laundered competitor enjoys advantages. If you change your shirt more than once a fortnight, you alter destiny one thread at a time. Imagine the quiet scandal of smelling faintly of juniper while bargaining over timber. Smell is a diplomat that never leaves fingerprints. A tidy beard, arranged to look deliberate rather than reluctant, could easily convince a buyer that the price of a barrel wanted to be kinder. Marriages and feasts made the bathhouse perform at a higher setting. Before a wedding, the building swelled with careful haste. The door learned a new choreography: open, close as relatives carried in baskets of towels that used to be shirts. Braids were trialed and retrialed, an exercise in patience and architecture. Beards practiced being symmetrical. Even the shy ear spoon earned a ceremonial role, one pass per ear, no grandstanding. Children were assigned the sacred task of warming the bench rags over a small stone, which made them hold their faces like officials. Steam rose like blessing. By nightfall, the whole household smelled of soap that had passed through wood smoke and come out as nostalgia. The legal system, which has a talent for noticing what people do frequently enough to cause trouble, set fines for cutting someone else's hair without permission. This tells us two things. First, alcohol existed. Second, hair mattered. A head of hair was not just a hat you grew yourself. It was a social document that recorded the intentions of combs. To share it as a prank was to edit another person. Silver paid in compensation, and order was satisfied. We see echoes of this seriousness in poetic metaphors, where a warrior is described by his hair as if by a credible witness. Clean and combed did not mean soft. It meant prepared. Soap did not supply every scent. For that, people asked plants. Herb gardens were the slow perfumers of the north. Juniper berries were dried and crushed. Birch tar whispered smoky stories. Angelica clocked in as a cheerful assistant. Small sachets of cloth filled with fragrant scraps slipped into chests where linen slept, so that a shirt pulled on a cold morning carried summer inside it like a kept promise. Trade sometimes added extravagance. A vial of something resinous from foreign merchants, sealed with wax that made every nose wonder about desserts. A single drop stirred into hot water could turn a bath into a map. People stepped out smelling faintly of reassurance and possibility, which is the ideal cologne. Despite all this, the gods did not appoint a patron of soap. If such a figure had existed, they would have been short-tempered about scum lines and tender-hearted about towels. As it was, cleanliness was understood as good manners before talking to powers you couldn't see. Before oaths, hands met water. Before sacrifices, faces were washed, not because dirt offends divinity, but because a person who has just splashed their face tends to choose words more carefully. Priests carried basins like portable lakes. The liquid shivered. People looked into it and met their quiet reflection, tidied by surface tension. Spill a little and the gods probably didn't mind. They invented rivers, and those are a lot of splashed architecture supported the habit with modest engineering. Many bathhouses were attached to structures already friendly with heat kitchens, weaving rooms, anything where fires had job security. Warmth traveled through walls the way rumors travel through households, inevitably. A shallow channel carried used water away, a good deed performed underneath everyone's feet. Roof vents negotiated a peace treaty between smoke and walls. In summer, the door lingered open to trade steam for birdsong. In winter, it learned to be precise, opening only wide enough for a person, and a very small amount of weather. The building didn't try to impress. It tried to work. Journeys adapted the routine. On ships where freshwater was currency, washing was abbreviated but not abandoned. A handful splashed on the face at dawn counted as a conversation with the sea. Combs and tweezers lived in pouches beside amulets because both improve luck in different departments. When raiders, if we must use the dramatic term, made camp, they scouted for a stream with the seriousness usually reserved for finding exits. Snow, when persuaded by a pot, became hot water, which is the definition of civilization in cold weather. A man might rinse his beard in melted snow and look immediately more agreeable, which is a form of diplomacy recognized by everyone with eyes. The Saxons' complaint about stolen hearts persisted because it contained everyday arithmetic. Well-groomed visitor plus clean linen plus conversational competence equals attention. Cleanliness turned into currency, not the kind you spend loudly, but the quiet type that makes a table feel a little more willing to set an extra plate. Think of the beard as a resume. Think of the comb as the pencil that corrects spelling. Think of the ear spoon as the silent reference that says, convincingly, this person tends to details. None of this solved wars or stopped storms. It just made the room better, which is almost the same thing if you're trying to live in it. Feasts amplified the principle. Imagine a long room where smoke practiced braiding itself under the rafters. Bowls of stew arrived steaming, and clean hands received them. Those hands had been washed in a basin carried around the hall before the meal. The water changed frequently to prevent soup chokes. Someone sprinkled herbs on the rushes underfoot so that feet felt virtuous without trying. The scent rose in company with songs. Men with tidy beards told stories with a slight edge of foam on their ale mustaches, and women with secure braids translated laughter for babies. When dishes were cleared, people felt pleasantly heavy and slightly improved, as if cleanliness and food had collaborated. By now we have circled the paradox enough times to be on familiar terms. The culture that sailed hard seas and collected scar tissue also scheduled hot water. The rings that carried house keys carried ear spoons. The same hands that negotiated timber prices insisted that shirts smell like juniper and that hair remember its duties. It isn't contradiction, it's proportion. Bold lives prefer small neatnesses the way large maps prefer accurate legends. The bathhouse didn't civilize raiders. It simply returned them to baseline. A person emerges from steam recognizably themselves. Only less enthusiastic about dust dot, we should linger on the sound of closing time. Stones cooled with tiny clicks, like knitting needles finishing a row. The rag on the bench remembered it had once been a shirt and prepared to resume that office tomorrow. The soap lay drying in its box like a pale loaf considering philosophy. The door opened to let darkness make comments and closed again to keep warmth from listening. Outside, the wind practiced polite knocking on turf. Inside, the last droplets condensed on beams and fell. The bathhouse's way of counting the day done. Saturday, half day, rejoined the calendar. The week shrugged back into its coat and prepared to start again with the quiet confidence that someone would warm the stones on schedule. Language carried the promise forward, smudging the meaning just enough to keep it comfortable, so that in far-off future places people would say Saturday and unknowingly nod toward a room of turf, a bench, a ladle, a comb, an ear spoon, and steam performing slow magic on winter shoulders. If you are still awake, the steam is patient. It knows most stories, and not with conclusions, but with breath growing even. The bathhouse is not going anywhere. The water will keep its small weather just for you. And by the time the door opens for the last time, you may already have drifted into a sleep that smells faintly of juniper and warm stone, with a comb resting where thoughts lie smooth.